Welcome to Lindamood-Bell Radio. I'm Dave Hungerford for Lindamood-Bell. Today's podcast is a webinar presented by my colleague Dave Kiyvyra, Director of Development for the Lindamood-Bell for Schools Division. Its title is Sensory Cognitive Instruction in Response to a State Dyslexia Mandate. Lindamood-Bell has pioneered unique programs that address reading, comprehension, and math. Our evidence-based approach is available to educators around the world. Teachers can get started by attending an online workshop in Seeing Stars, Visualizing and Verbalizing, or LIPS, the Lindamood Phoneme Sequencing Program. The programs are suitable for diverse learning needs, including students with dyslexia or autism. Get details and learn more at lindamoodbell.com.
Welcome to the Lindamood-Bell presentation on sensory cognitive instruction in response to a state dyslexia mandate. My name is Dave Kiyvyra. I'm the Director of Development for Lindamood-Bell for Schools. And I'm going to walk you through our presentation today. Just as background, if you're not familiar with Lindamood-Bell, we are an organization that's been around for a little bit over 30 years now. We have learning centers across the country where students come and receive intensive one-on-one instruction. And then we also have the division of the organization that I work with, which is Lindamood-Bell for Schools, in which we train teachers in order to help them be able to implement the programs with their students. And, you know, we'd love to have you visit our website, which is lindamoodbell.com, learn a little bit more about the work that we do. And obviously, we're going to be talking about that work today. And I want to open by just talking a little bit more in depth about dyslexia. Obviously, it's a topic that has garnered lots of attention across the nation. Fortunately, it has, because for years there wasn't as much attention paid to it. In particular, the fact that students with dyslexia could be both recognized and that their challenges could be remediated for. And that's caused, you know, just an enormous number of students over time to really struggle with the basic skills of reading, leading to all kinds of impacts, obviously, around social and emotional aspects of being in schools and what that means long-term for those students. So what we're going to talk about today is what a scientific theoretical model to address reading difficulties is. What that'll look like. We're going to talk about that from sort of a big picture perspective first, and then we'll begin to drill down a little bit. In particular, I want to talk about, you know, there's the theoretical model that exists, but what does that look like when you put that theoretical model into practice within a given school district? So we'll talk about that piece with regard to what's sensory cognitive instruction looks like when teachers are implementing this with their students. We're going to talk about what the impacts of providing that type of instruction are. And then we'll talk a little bit about the why and the science behind that, what some of the research shows is happening in students' brains as they're receiving that type of instruction. And then I thought it might be really valuable to kind of wrap up with just talking about, okay, great, we've discussed big picture what the theory is. We've looked at what it looks like within a given district. Now we see what some of the research is on it. Well, what does it look like in terms of the actual program? And so give you a little bit of insight into what the programs that we talk about at Lindamood-Bell primarily are, and that's Seeing Stars program for working with students who are struggling with decoding, the Visualizing and Verbalizing program for students who are struggling with language comprehension. Right? So we'll start, and our primary focus will be around that decoding end today, but I want to talk about both of those pieces as we go. So if we kind of level set back to what dyslexia is, there's been sort of a common definition that's been talked about since the early 2000s, and that is here on the screen. You can certainly read through it here. What I want to highlight is that within this definition, it talks about these difficulties as typically resulting from a deficit in the phonological component of language, right? And that emphasis on the phonology has led to a lot of instruction, very heavily based on phonology, and diving very deeply into that. And yet, there is a lot of recent research that is kind of challenging the idea that phonology component is the definitive deficit for dyslexia, that might actually be a little bit too simplistic. And that research is showing that there is this sensory cognitive function of symbol imagery. And the critical piece about symbol imagery is that it's necessary for both the phonological and orthographic components of reading, right? Putting those two pieces together, the sounds, that phonological piece, and the orthographic, those written letters, the printed letters, right? And that research is showing that there is an instructional model that can concurrently address both the phonological and orthographic components of reading. And that if we do that, if we provide instruction that works on both of those areas at the same time, it can result in very significant gains in reading, even for students who have specific labels of dyslexia. And so we'll talk a little bit about what symbol imagery is, right? And symbol imagery is that sensory cognitive function that we're discussing. So if I show you all a word really quickly, and it's a nonsense word, but if you take a look at it and then I take it away, I could ask you to tell me back what that word says, right? And if you were holding on to the picture of those letters in your mind, you might be able to go back and say to yourself, oh, FLISP. That says flisp, right? And if you didn't get it, I'll show it to you again really quickly. There it is, there's flisp, right? Now I could ask you a series of questions if we're thinking about what symbol imagery is, right? What did you picture for your third letter in the word flisp? If you're thinking about it, you're saying to yourself, flisp. Oh, I'm picturing an I there. Great. How about your fourth letter? An S. How about your fifth letter? A P. Now, that's that ability to hold on to those letters in your mind. So if I'm asking you those questions, I know that you're holding on to those letters, right? Now I could do some exercises with you. So I could say, switch your fourth and fifth letter around, or your last two letters around, and tell me what the word says now. Now you could say, oh, FLI. I had SP. I need to switch those two around. PS. Oh, it says flips, right? And that's working on that phonological component of the word. And there was our word again originally. We switched those last two letters around, and now we've got flips, right? And I could even say to you some other questions, like, what'd you picture for your vowel sound? Right? And you could say, oh, I'm picturing an I. What sound does it make? Eh. Change it to an A. I would say flasp, right? And that's good, what we call symbol imagery, that ability to create mental images for sounds and letters within words. And it's a sensory cognitive function for both orthographic and phonological processing, as we were just going through and doing, right? It was both questioning to that orthographic process of being able to hold on to and image those letters in your mind. And then that phonological piece of doing some exercises like identifying a letter and telling me the sound that it makes, switching two letters around and telling me the word that results from that change. In students who struggle with phonemic awareness and symbol imagery, often obviously have a lot of those basic challenges that we see in terms of their decoding, right? Things like weak word attack skills, but also weak word recognition skills, right? There are certainly students who may learn how to sound out words, but they still can't recognize that word when they see it in the next paragraph, even though they just sounded it out. So real difficulty learning and retaining sight words despite lots of practice. They may have weak phonological spelling skills, so they don't get a vowel sound in there for each syllable. And you can kind of contrast that with weak orthographic spelling skills, where a student can make that word say opportunity because they've done lots and lots and lots of phonemic awareness activities, but they can't hold on to the one correct pattern for it. And these students will obviously have real difficulty reading fluently in context. They're not monitoring, or they're not necessarily aware of what they're doing as they're reading and the mistakes that they make. Or if they are aware of it, they still can't figure out how to correct it themselves. And so they have very slow and laborious decoding skills. They may be labeled as dyslexic. And of course, in many cases, they may not be labeled as dyslexic, right? They're just students who are struggling. So hang on to this idea of these symptoms of a weakness in phonemic awareness and symbol imagery, what we've been talking about, and kind of contrast these pieces with what we talk about as concept imagery. Concept imagery is the ability to kind of create what I would call a movie in your mind for language as it's coming in, right? And that's what allows you to, say, read a book, put it down, and still be able to summarize what it was that you just read, right? That's good concept imagery, different than symbol imagery, right? Very different. And so what are some symptoms of weak concept imagery? Weak concept imagery shows itself in issues around just basic language comprehension, whether written or oral language. And then obviously, as those pieces are applied to critical thinking, right? Difficulty with following a basic sequence of instructions, expressing language orally. So you can think about those kids who can't really describe to you effectively what it is that they're thinking about, whether they're using too few words or too many words. And how it is that ties into students' writing, right? If they can't verbalize very effectively, they're not going to be able to write very effectively. And then it has, various real world challenges that you can see in there. In particular, things like being able to attend to what it is that's happening in the classroom or happening in the real world, and being able to focus and grasp that information, right? So that's the symptoms of weak concept imagery. And it's important to hold on to this idea that all of these pieces have to integrate, right? In order to become a complete reader, students do have to have good phonological processing and tie that over into their word attack. But they also have to have good orthographic processing, so that when they're sounding out words, they're also beginning to map those sounds and letters in their mind so that they can recognize those very quickly on the page. And they have to have a well-developed vocabulary so they can use contextual cues to help propel them as they're reading. And all of those pieces have to work together in order to feed into the whole point of reading, which is comprehension, right? Reading without comprehension is not actually reading, it's just decoding. And we're going to talk a lot about decoding today, but I don't want us to lose track of the fact that there are some students who can decode effectively, but still cannot comprehend what it is that they're just reading, right? And that goes to that concept imagery that we just discussed. So I like to talk about this Venn diagram. We talk about it all the time at Lindamood-Bell because we want to think about our students and say, our students are struggling with reading. That's a big picture statement. Right? They're struggling with reading. Where are they struggling with reading and why? And if I have to figure out that piece, because that's going to tell me, A, what type of intervention I want to do with them, and B, how am I going to group them with other students who need that same sort of intervention at that same level, right? So if I look at this Venn diagram, what type of assessments do I have that are telling me, is my student struggle with reading about their phonological processing and their word attack? Or is it about their orthographic processing and their word recognition? Or is it an issue of low vocabulary? Or is it global? All of those pieces are okay, but they still don't comprehend what it is that they're decoding. And of course, to what extent is it related to each of these different pieces, right? Maybe they struggle in multiple areas. And you can think about the importance of that in terms of the importance of a teacher's ability to differentiate instruction to meet students' needs, and a teacher's need to be able to group students effectively based on the commonality of where their struggles are, right? So really being able to dig into detail into those pieces. And we're going to talk about some assessments a little bit later related to the implementation of these programs that'll help you think about that Venn diagram. So we'll talk a bit about what the dual coding theory is and symbol imagery in more detail, right? Dual coding theory is a theory of cognition created by a gentleman named Alan Pavio. It's been very heavily researched and is shown as one of the strongest candidates for a unified scientific-based theory of literacy, which is really exciting to hear. And there's a picture of Alan Pavio, and he talked about cognition, our ability to understand something, is proportional to the extent that you can create mental representations for language, and that language and mental representations are integrated together. And that obviously students are going to, or individuals overall, I should say, are going to differ pretty widely in the ability to access those coding mechanisms, right? And that's important when we think about the process of reading, because earlier I was mentioning that definition of dyslexia and the focus on phonological-based instruction and how heavily that's become imprinted in what's happening with students instructionally. And when Lindamood-Bell first began, the primary program that we did was a program called the LIPS program. It stands for Lindamood Phoneme Sequencing. And when I first started working at Lindamood-Bell, I've been with the organization a little bit over 20 years. That was the program that I learned. I would sit down and start working with students one-on-one, hour after hour. And so I might do 8 sessions a day of doing the LIPS program with students, which is very heavily focused on helping students notice the articulatory feedback in order to underlie their phonemic awareness, so they can feel sounds in their mouth in order to locate those sounds within words and sequence those sounds within words. And what we discovered is kind of outlined here. And I really experienced this in working with kids, right? They would make these phenomenal gains in terms of their phonemic awareness. And we'd use mouth pictures to represent sounds, and then colored blocks to represent sounds. And that really helped them be able to locate sounds within words and develop their ability to sound out words. The challenge was when we went to go read in text, my students couldn't recognize those words. And so they could sound out words now, but they were sounding out each and every single word on the page. And obviously, when they got to larger amounts of text, what they did was revert back to just guessing at the words because they couldn't sound it out quickly enough and they couldn't hold on to it, right? So students, in addition, when they went to go spell, were spelling phonologically rather than relying on their orthography as well. And so that's what really drove the derivation of thinking about, well, what is symbol imagery and what is it that we do as good readers and good spellers when we sit down and we read? And so again, just to level set, that's where we talk about our language processing spectrum as ranging from students who have a weakness in decoding and might be classified as students who have dyslexia, their weaknesses in symbol imagery. And then at the other end, you've got students with weak comprehension, who at the far end of that spectrum might be labeled as students who are hyperlexic, meaning they can decode just about anything but can't comprehend what they just decoded. And many students with autism are hyperlexic, right? And that's a weakness in concept imagery, that ability to create a movie in your mind for language as it's coming in. Okay, so that's big picture of the sort of theory of what we're talking about in the dual coding theory, the idea of symbol imagery and concept imagery. And now we'll talk a little bit about, what's the reality of implementing these programs in a district and what happens when you do so. And so we're going to talk about a district called Fort Smith Public Schools, which is in the state of Arkansas. Arkansas several years ago passed some dyslexia legislation that outlined a couple of different specific things that needed to happen, including universal screening for all K2 students, an initial intervention cycle for those students who were noticed in that screening process as struggling, and then a secondary screening process if those students continued to struggle, and then intervention groups specifically designed for students with characteristics of dyslexia. And the state did a lot of great work around doing dyslexia awareness training for all of their teachers. They call their training RISE training, in order to really bring awareness across the spectrum for teachers about what it is that's happening when students are struggling with reading and what it is that needs to happen for those kids. So a little bit of background for Fort Smith. It's a district of about 14,000 students, and it's a very diverse district. All the schools within the district are Title I schools. And In 2019, they had about 583 students who by that point had been recognized as having characteristics of dyslexia and receiving intervention in those dyslexia intervention groups. Right? And so Lindamood-Bell started to partner with Fort Smith back in 2016-17. And the district really wanted to look at bringing in a program that was going to address all the component parts of reading. What they liked about Lindamood-Bell was their ability that the programs are based on responding to the student's response in a very Socratic manner, so that teachers are taught to engage students in first being aware of what it is that they're doing on a sensory cognitive level, and allowing those students an opportunity to compare what they did back to what they were supposed to do, and allowing those students the opportunity to self-correct. And that really drove and empowered students to begin to recognize that they could overcome these challenges, and really drove a lot of positive reading outcomes for those kids. And that the program is not scripted, right? So it allows for teachers to differentiate instruction for their students, which, as we all know, is what should be happening, but can't happen if a program is scripted, right? If a program is saying, here's what you should do at 2 weeks, here's what you do at 4 weeks, here's what you do at 6 weeks, that's not allowing for differentiation based on the needs of our students. So we rolled out sort of an initial pilot with the district, working with K through 2 classroom teachers, as well as other support staff within the district, and did initial workshops with teachers, and then crucially provided some job-embedded professional development for them. So as the research shows about how it is that we learn as adults, we don't learn from just a one-shot workshop and go back and implement a program with fidelity. Instead, what we need is ongoing support, and crucially support as we're working with our students. And so what we were able to provide to Fort Smith was using a virtual platform, such as the one that I'm providing this workshop, this presentation to you now. Lindamood-Bell's virtual consultants can sit in on an actual session where teachers are working with students, and they can model the lesson. They can co-teach with that teacher. They can provide feedback as the teacher is working with those students. And it's a really dynamic environment where now I get the opportunity to take what I learned in that initial workshop and be able to refine it as I'm working with my students. So the district was really excited about that sort of model of professional development. And then doubly excited when they saw what some of the changes were in the district when they looked at how are these pilot schools doing in terms of their DIBELS assessments, which is the assessment that they were using. And we came in partway through the year and did the training for teachers, I think in November and December, so they could start to implement it mid-year. And you can see in this chart where the students were. There's about 392 kids on the different components of the DIBELS assessment at mid-year. So 392 students, if we look right here in the middle, about 317 of those kids were below benchmark at mid-year. So that's obviously a huge challenge, right? Already at mid-year, we've got almost all of the kids below benchmark in some of these parts of reading. And oftentimes, what happens over the course of the year is that, in fact, that deficit grows for those kids, right? If they're already behind at mid-year, they often fall further and further behind. Instead, as classroom teachers started to use the Seeing Stars program, about 15 minutes a day in a whole classroom setting with their kids, and then, supplementing their traditional reading program, what they saw was by the time they got to the end of the year and post-tested those kids on the DIBELS, they had significantly dropped the number of students who were below benchmark. So they just really excited about that and said, hey, there are some real systemic challenges that we have as a district, been working very, very hard to try to resolve the reading challenges that students are having. And yet we continue to have these challenges. They have a high English language learner population. They believe that they had a real vocabulary challenge there. They did really successfully identify that though they had trained their reading interventionists and their special ed teachers, that they might be able to exit kids from intervention, but if they had just as many kids coming in as they historically had in need of intervention, they weren't going to gain any ground. So at some point, they had to really address that kindergarten through second grade challenge. What was happening in that K-2 classroom? So the changes that they made were to train all of their K through 2 teachers in Seeing Stars program and visualizing and verbalizing programs so they could use that in a whole classroom setting. They trained all their dyslexia interventionists and all of their special educators, and then rolled that out to the district as a whole, to all of their elementary schools in year 1. And here's what it looked like for the end of year 1 implementation for students that were receiving small group intervention. So this was about 343 kids. And these were kids who obviously had already been identified as being struggling readers. So they were going to small group intensive intervention. The intervention was being provided to them intensively. So it was daily or as close to daily as it could possibly get, for as close to an hour as we could get. And I think in Fort Smith, in practical senses, was able to get 45 minutes per day, 5 days a week, or as close to 5 days a week as they could. In that first year, they were getting on average 63 hours of instruction over the course of the school year for those students. And if we take a look at an assessment battery that shows all the different component parts of reading, so symbol imagery, word attack, which is from the Woodcock-Johnson, word recognition, which is from the wide range achievement test, spelling, and then reading rate, accuracy, and fluency as students are reading through passages, a comprehension measure that looks at, okay, they read those passages, can they answer main idea and higher order thinking questions based on that? And then an assessment of oral directions and their basic vocabulary. Remember earlier, they felt like they had a real vocabulary weakness or challenge in the district. When you look at the pretest, that's in their light blue there on all of those different assessments. The students actually, the highest part that they came in on was their vocabulary. So these are students whose vocabulary is pretty good. And in fact, the next highest measure is their reading comprehension. And, you know, the quote unquote normal range runs from the 25th to the 75th for most of these assessments. So these students are right on the cusp of the normal range for their vocabulary. Comprehension is a little bit below, but it's still 16th percentile is great in comparison to their reading fluency being at the 3rd percentile, right? Their reading accuracy being at the 3rd percentile, their fluency being at the 2nd. So despite the fact that these students couldn't accurately read a passage, their comprehension was at the 16th percentile. So if we can change that reading accuracy for them, it can make a huge impact. And so based on just 63 hours of instruction, these students made, the asterisk denotes statistically significant changes, they made statistically significant changes across every single one of those areas that was assessed. And in fact, a lot of those, if you look at the orange over here, were large standard score changes. So though percentile-wise, it may not look like a very big jump to go from the 3rd percentile to the 6th percentile in reading accuracy, in terms of standard scores, that's actually a very large jump. And the impact of that was that their comprehension moved from below the normal range to the normal range, right? Because they had improved their reading accuracy and improved their reading fluency so they could now gain more content, pull more information off of the page. So really excited to take a look at those results from year 1, which then led into thinking about, okay, how can we refine this? And earlier I mentioned had about 63 hours of instruction on average, and some schools had much more, some schools had less. So they wanted to try to take a look at how can we even that out so that we really are getting to those sessions. I know those of you who may work with students who are struggling with reading in buildings and you may be pulling them out, you know how inconsistent that sometimes is. There could be all kinds of different factors that are causing that inconsistency. And yet we know that these kids are probably going to need at least 80 to 120 hours of intensive intervention in order to close gaps. How do we get to that? Well, in terms of things that happen in the building, you all know what the key indicator is, right? The key driver of that is the principal, right? The principal is the person who can help drive and ensure that kids are getting the intervention time that they need to get. And so really the district looked at that and said, okay, well, how can we start to work more in depth with these principals to really get them working together and understanding what it is that needs to happen for kids. So we started taking a look at a couple different things. One was monthly school by school comparisons in terms of how much instructional time it was happening. So at the district level, they could see which schools are getting more instructional time, which schools are getting less. And principals could say to themselves, hey, wow, I'm not getting as much instruction time as this other school. Maybe I can talk to that principal and find out what they're doing differently. And then did a lot of principal buy-in by creating some principal walkthroughs. So I talked earlier about those virtual coaching sessions. We actually set it up so that principals could sit in on those virtual coaching sessions and see the instruction happening for students. And then get a chance to debrief with the project director afterwards, talk a little bit about what it was that they just saw. And that created that background knowledge for principals about, oh, now I know what to look for when I'm seeing good instruction, and helped teachers know, yep, my principals bought in because they are coming to my session and seeing what it is that's happening. One of the other things that the district wanted to do was take a look at, okay, we've got this large population of students that's struggling. How can we try to provide them an even more intensive opportunity to learn how to read? And so we did a partnered together to do a summer school pilot. And the students came 3 hours per day, 5 days a week for a month. All of the teachers received job embedded PD as they were providing the instruction to the students. And that went on for 1 month over the course of the summer. It did a lot of engagement activities to make it a lot of fun, had prizes and other things that students could earn for participating in this. And when we took a look at the pre to post for about 19 students, these kids got 60 hours of instruction over the course of that month. What we saw was just really phenomenal gains by ramping up the intensity of the instructional time, right? If they're getting 3 hours a day, 5 days a week now we're getting those same 60 hours that previously took us an entire school year to get. We're now getting those 60 hours in just 1 month. What's the impact? As you can see here, it's much, much larger, right? And very, very quickly, we're seeing students' reading accuracy going from the 4th to the 18th percentile. And so you can see that huge jump in reading accuracy there. So some really fantastic gains in many areas going from below the normal range into the normal range. And that was that decoding piece, obviously, or we're talking about the Seeing Stars program. And I did want to contrast that again. We talked earlier about concept imagery and comprehension. Not all of our students who are struggling with reading, again, are struggling with it because they're having difficulty decoding. Some kids can decode successfully, but they can't comprehend. So what do those kids look like? So if we pivot for a moment, and actually, I'm going to go back. I'm not trying to make you too crazy by switching screens, but if we look at these students, remember their reading accuracy was at the 4th percentile on the pretest, and their comprehension was at the 27th percentile, despite that low reading accuracy. If I pivot now and take a look at some kids who've been identified with a comprehension weakness, we can see their reading accuracy is at the 21st percentile, right? But their comprehension is down at the 10th percentile, right? So they've got a higher reading accuracy than they have a comprehension level. With these other students who are decoding students, they've got a higher comprehension than they have a reading accuracy. And so again, when we think about differentiating for students, both of these groups of students, we can identify and say they struggle with reading, but they're not struggling with reading for the same reason at all. And so I don't want to provide them the same intervention, and I don't want to group them together. They need something different. So these students were getting visualizing and verbalizing. They got about 60 hours. They got 60 hours of instruction over those 3 weeks or 4 weeks. And look at their comprehension gains. Again, all of those decoding measures were already coming in high. So we weren't going to focus on decoding. Instead, we're going to focus on how do you create that movie in your mind. And look at their comprehension jumping from the 10th percentile to the 32nd percentile. So you've got kids who are coming in below normal range. They do 4 weeks of intensive instruction over the summer. They're coming back in well established in the normal range for reading comprehension. Think about how that changes what happens for them when they go back to class in August. Significantly different experience for them, right? Okay. So we talked a little bit about the principal look-ins, lesson planning, standardizing what was happening at K2, looking to increase the hours of instruction for students, monthly principal updates. We then expanded the summer camp out to 7 sites. And then as things grew in terms of elementary school, began to make even more changes going into year 3. Tapering back some of the coaching because some of that instructional expertise was really growing. And so being able to apply that job embedded PD to other teachers, starting to refine what it was that was happening at the secondary level, really working together as a district to align with the state standards, and doing whole school response to intervention for specific at-risk sites. And as a district, as they went through this process, as I mentioned, we started partnering together in the latter half of the 2016-17 school year. Coming into 2017, the district switched from using Dibbles to using iStation as their universal screener. And what we looked at the beginning of 2017 was comparing the number of students who were scoring in the highest performing tier on iStation and the number of students who were scoring at the lowest tier in iStation. So this was looking at all of their kindergarten through 2nd grade kids at the beginning of September. What they saw was the number of students scoring in that highest tier was very close to the number of students scoring in the lowest tier, right? And again, if we think about what the dyslexia legislation said, those students scoring in the lowest tier need to be provided small group intervention. Well, that's a huge number of my kids in need of small group intervention, almost as many as my kids who don't need small group intervention. That's not really viable as a district, right? And so that's where it led into that whole idea of, hey, we need to be doing something different in K2 classrooms. And so as teachers began to implement 15 minutes of Seeing Stars and 15 minutes of VV whole classroom with their students, what they started to see was by the end of that first year, a very large gap open up between how many students were scoring at that highest tier and crucially, how many were scoring in the lowest. As we went to September of 2018, there was a little dip, right? You have new kindergarten students coming in, but still much higher than the September of 2017, right? I've got a lot more kids scoring in the highest tier. I've got almost 200 fewer students scoring in the lowest tier at the beginning of September. So that's huge. And look, by the end of the year, again, gone back up to even higher peak than the previous year. 1,800 kids scoring in the highest tier, and we're down to 621 in the lowest tier. So we're really driving that systemic change that we want to have embodied. I've got now almost, more than 300 kids fewer in need of intervention in my K2 classrooms 2 years in. Then we got to September 2019, and then partway through the year, we were starting to see that divide happen again. Again, at the start of the year in September 2019, these numbers were better. Number of students scoring in the highest tier, number of students scoring in the lowest tier in comparison with the previous Septembers. And then we got through mid-year, and then of course, everything went sort of haywire in that school year. So that was showing that real systemic change that the district wanted to see happen in the K2 classrooms that they had identified all the way back at the beginning, which was really exciting for them to see. And obviously we know that last year was a real challenge to provide instruction to students with schools shutting down periodically, folks being sent home to quarantine and come back. But the district continued on providing small group intensive intervention to students. And when we looked at their students who were identified as having characteristics of dyslexia, there were 541 of them. Even with everything that was happening, they got about 57 hours of intensive intervention And what's really exciting to see is that, again, they made statistically significant gains across all of those different measures. And that those were large, a lot of those were large standard score changes, right? Particularly in accuracy and fluency, exactly where we need to see those changes happening. And again, these are kids whose vocabulary and comprehension is pretty good, right? In comparison to where their accuracy and fluency was, right? So as we think about that sort of real world, the reality of what it is that's happening as you implement these programs with students in districts, I want to think about, why is that happening? What is it that's happening with these students' brains? What's changing for them over the course of that instructional time? And so there's been a ton of research done on the programs, and I don't want to dive too deeply into this, but I want to give you a sense of what it is that's happening so that you can walk away with that. You can certainly look more deeply into these research studies. They've been published, so you can certainly look them up. We'll talk about a couple of them from the University of Washington that were really exciting. And these were on students who were specifically labeled as students who'd had dyslexia. And this was a randomized controlled intervention study trying to look at what it was that was happening via brain scans in these different parts of the brain as students received instruction from pre to post, right? And so there were a couple of different studies here. The first one took a look at what was happening in terms of both reading skills and white matter growth in struggling readers. And so they looked at some MRI data across a couple of different intervals during 8 weeks of intensive reading intervention. These are students who were getting the Seeing Stars program. And they saw that there were large scale changes throughout the white matter, and that was in concert with growth and reading skills. So really exciting to be able to see that throughout that interval study. And here's sort of a quick summary of it. The students grew by an entire grade level, and that growth correlated to changes in white matter conductivity, right? And that subjects that were in the control group or that comparison group didn't show any changes. And so this really showed that the development of symbol imagery led to an increase in the brain structure conductivity and improved reading for children who had dyslexia. Then there was a second study that was done. Second study looked at, is there really a sensitive period of time for when this needs to happen, right? We always talk about the need for early intervention. And I think sometimes the idea of focusing on early intervention gets conflated with, if we don't do it early, there isn't any point in doing intervention, right? And we see the reality of that sometimes happen in schools where in the early years, schools are very heavily focused on providing intervention when students are receiving special ed, and maybe later they're not as much, right? And that we're shifting to, well, let's help the kids access the content material. And so what was really exciting about this study was that they found that when they looked at different ages of students, the magnitude and time course of plasticity does not depend on the subject's age. So that for reading intervention, if there is a sensitive time period for when it needs to happen, that sensitive time period does not end before middle school. So that's really exciting information to walk away from. That just because we haven't resolved this very early does not mean that we can't resolve this for students later. Right? Obviously, the earlier we do it, the better, right? The less social emotional challenges students face over years of struggling. It's just to say that when we do get our kids to the latter part of elementary school and even into secondary school, we should continue to think about being able to remediate those issues with students. And then there was a third study, and the third study looked at what kind of changes happened depending on how much instruction students got. So these students got 160 hours of intervention over 8 weeks. And then they were collecting data over 4 different times, right? Based on decoding, oral reading fluency, and comprehension. And then also looking at how the period of time was impacting that. And what they saw was that there was what's called a linear dose response relationship between the hours of intervention and improvement in reading ability. And that there was linear growth in every measure of reading skill, and none of those measures showed nonlinear growth. In other words, put it in layman's terms, the more instruction students got, the better they did. And they're across all of those measures. As the hours increased, the more they improved. There wasn't any part of that that didn't correlate. So the decoding skills showed substantial growth. And that this means that, again, I can be thinking about, based on where my students' struggles are, the more time I provide them instruction, the more impact I'm going to have. Right? And Jason Yateman, who is the principal investigator in the study, I think has a great quote in which he talks about that many parents and teachers are worried that dyslexia is permanent, and that what his research is showing is that targeted intensive reading programs can lead to substantial improvement in reading and also change the underlying wiring of the brain circuitry. Right? And we saw the reality of that in Fort Smith too, right? With kids who got now, we were talking earlier about 60 hours of instruction. What about kids who got 164 hours of instruction over the course of 3 school years now of intervention? What happened with them? Did they make those same sorts of gains? And when we look at their standard score changes, yep, every single one of those areas is in the orange. Every single one of those areas of decoding is in the orange, right? Leading to those significant changes in comprehension as well. So super exciting to see. And one of the challenges is to say, well, kids are getting intervention. What does it mean for them long term? It's great while they're getting intervention. At some point, though, we have to get them back into the classroom. And what happens when they get back into the classroom? Are they going to be able to continue that growth? And that's where I think there's been a lot of very exciting research, and you can look this study up as well. And there were sort of 2 parts to the study. This was done at Georgetown University. One looking at, were there changes in gray matter volume in response to students' instruction, students who had been identified as being dyslexic. And so what the study found quickly was that, in fact, there were increases in volume of gray matter at the end of the intervention, specifically in areas of memory and mental imagery. And then the second part of the study looked at what happens after the intervention, right? And so what this kind of graph shows is, here's where the students were in terms of change in gray matter volume when the study began, right? And T1 to T2 is as students are receiving that intervention, right? So T1, T2 is at the end of the intervention. This is the amount of change in gray matter volume. And so then what they said is, okay, well, now let's leave these kids alone for a little bit. Have them come back in. We're not going to provide any more intervention to them. Have them come back and let's see if those gray matter volume changes continued. And so that was T3. They came back and was measured again. And in fact, the growth that had happened continued, right? And that's what's really exciting. Get enough instructional time with kids who can change the way in which their brain is functioning and do so on a permanent level so they can maintain that change over time. And then one more study we'll talk about, which is out of MIT. And the interesting thing about this study, this was looking at impact of summer reading intervention for students with reading difficulties. And what I found to be kind of fascinating about this was that at baseline, at the very beginning, what they had noticed was they were able to take a look at some students being at a higher socioeconomic status and some students being of lower socioeconomic status. And what did that mean? And the higher socioeconomic status students correlated, as you might predict, with greater vocabulary skills and also greater cortical thickness in the brain, which is an interesting association to see, right? And then when they provided intervention to students, what they saw from the students that received intervention was the lower socioeconomic status students made greater reading improvement and grew greater cortical thickening than did the students of higher socioeconomic status, which is really exciting because it means that summer reading intervention obviously is coupled with cortical growth, but is particularly beneficial for children with reading difficulties who come from a low socioeconomic status environment. And that's the reality of a lot of our kids that we see struggling with reading in schools. And so it's exciting to see that happen here, and have that validated through research, right? Okay. So we've talked about sort of theory of dual coding, talked about symbol imagery and what the role of that is for both phonological and orthographic processing. Talked about concept imagery, the importance of that for oral language comprehension and written language comprehension. And it's nice to be able to compare and contrast those two pieces, right? Another way that I think is cool to sometimes think about it, Pat Lindamood always used to talk about contrast aids perception, right? Better understand one thing by contrasting it with something that it's not. And so we can think about sometimes decoding as being about the parts of reading, right? Figuring out what all of those sounds are and the patterns in words and mapping sounds and letters and words. So that's about the parts of reading. Comprehension is about the whole of reading. What do all of those words on the page mean together, right? And so as we've talked about, obviously, a student struggling with the parts of reading, figuring out the individual sounds within words, is going to need one type of intervention. Student who knows the sounds and letters that go into words, they got the parts, they struggle with the whole. What do all of those words mean when I put them together onto the page? They're going to need a different type of intervention, right? So seeing stars is the decoding intervention that students will receive, and visualizing and verbalizing is the comprehension intervention that students would receive. So I thought it would be cool to take a look a little bit at some of the program steps really quickly. And the steps of seeing stars are systematic, right? They're cumulative. They go from working at the parts, individual sounds, and teaching those sounds and letters first, then putting those sounds and letters that you're just introducing into syllable patterns, so that students are getting to do some of the exercises like we did with FLISP earlier, where I show the card to the student with the letters that we just practiced in isolation. I take it away. I ask them to picture those in their mind, and we do some changes to those words. We then do a task called Image and Read with the Syllable Board, which is where students are getting a chance to use an actual tactile board and write with their finger the different letters. They're not, it's not leaving an imprint behind, right? But it's a way to help them tactilely feel and picture the letters in those words. And then apply that imaging and reading and that air writing that we've been doing down onto the page by having students read words on the page. And these steps are overlapping within a given lesson, right? So that I'm introducing a set of sounds. We're practicing those in syllable patterns where the student sees the word and then it's taken away. Then we're doing some activities where they're only working on it in terms of their imagery and their phonological awareness. Now that we've woken up that imagery, we apply it down onto the page on their workbooks. And that imagery can be applied to sight words, spelling, and obviously on into multisyllabic words. And so I'm going to take a moment to stop sharing my screen for just a second. And we'll see if I can get this to work. We'll go in and we'll take a look at some materials. So we'll take a look at, well, what do these steps look like in actual practice? So I'll share my screen again. Okay. So if I look at consonant and vowel cards, for example, if we look at our consonants, these are the cards that will come in the Seeing Stars kit. They have the letters on the back. They've got an explanation of what sound the letter makes so that the teacher can be looking at that, how they should produce it, what the activity should be. Showing the card to the student for a moment, telling them the name of the letter and the sound that it makes. Take it away. The student writes the letter up in the air, saying the name of the letter as they're writing it, and then the sound that it makes, right? And then we move on to the next one and go through a very organized sequence of introducing these sounds. working on both consonants as well as vowels. And here are the vowel cards. And we can sort of see the way in which these are organized, starting with very basic short vowel sounds and then moving into more complex vowel sounds as the student progresses, right? So that's that first step of just showing consonant and vowel cards. I then said, you want to put these into practice, right? So what does that look like? Well, if I've introduced a couple of consonants and a couple of vowels, I'm not just going to keep practicing that and practicing that and practicing that. I want to go ahead and put those into some syllable cards because that's where the real application begins to happen. So if I go to, let's try this one. Come over here. Now I've got a short vowel that I just introduced and a consonant that I just introduced, and I can put it into a pattern for my student. So my student takes a look at that. I take it away. They write A, P up in the air. What does that say? App. Great. What do you picture for your second letter? P. What do you picture for your first letter? A. What sound does that letter make? Ah. Right. Then we can go on to the next one. Right. And initially, we're changing just one sound or one letter from one word to the next, right? So app to op to ob to ab. So students are getting to work on that comparing and contrasting that I just talked about, Pat Lindamood mentioning. Contrast aids perception, right? That we're getting to work on, and we're working on a closed circle of sounds, right? Just those ones that I introduced as I'm going through there, okay? So that's what the syllable cards look like. And then we talked about doing some of that syllable board practice and some of that imagery practice. And then I want to put that down into practice on my decoding workbooks. And so if I just did a set of short vowels and consonants, I can go and I can find a set of pages that is going to work on, there we go, some of those same sounds, but now applying this activity down onto the page. And I can certainly cover up the word at any time and ask the student what letters they pictured. But I'm going through this and practicing now those same sounds. What sounds does the letter A make? What sounds does the letter I make? P and T and B. And I've practiced them in isolation with my letter imagery cards. I've reinforced that with my syllable cards where I'm showing it and taking it away. Then they're getting to practice it entirely in their imagery. And now we apply it down onto the page. And every single lesson, all of those different steps are happening. Right? So that's a little bit of what the Seeing Stars program looks like. If I back up and I take you, now we can contrast that. So that's my student who's struggling with decoding, right? And that's how I'm going to help them improve their reading and their spelling. Now, what do I do with students who are struggling with comprehension? So that we talked about how that was going to be the visualizing and verbalizing program. And so the first step in visualizing and verbalizing, if we're talking about making a movie in your mind and picturing for language as it comes in, we first have to establish a common vocabulary for what we're talking about and what we look for from a picture. And so the first step is to use something called picture-to-picture, in which students looking at, this is the flip book that comes in the kit, students looking at a picture that's in front of them. And they'll be looking at this picture the whole time. The teacher has on the backside a guide for them. And they're saying to the student, here's the picture. I don't get to see it. Your words are going to help me see that same picture in my mind, right? And the reality, of course, is the teacher does need to know what the picture is that the student's looking at so that you can frame your questioning correctly, right? And so you're questioning to the whole. So what's the main thing in this picture, the what? And then you begin to drive on some of the details because you want the student to learn what it means to describe a picture. So you're going to go through a series of different structure words that you'll teach the student about, talking about what? Size, color, number, how many dogs should I be picturing, right? And you're framing all of these questions and grounding them in the idea of what should I be picturing for that? So what should I be picturing for where this is happening? Should I picture that it's inside someone's house? Should I picture that it's outside in the grass? What should I be picturing? And the students looking at the picture, and if they haven't said it yet, they're going to say, oh yeah, Yeah, it's outside. I forgot to mention that because there's grass there. Great. What should I picture for the movement, right? And remember to be including, we were talking earlier and I sort of dropped it, but that sensory cognitive information, that sensory cognitive language of what are you picturing for something rather than just saying, what is it in the picture? But what should I picture that you're looking at? What should I picture for the movement rather than saying, what's the dog doing? Is he moving, right? I'm also not asking yes, no questions. And so that's what that picture to picture step looks like when we're first getting started with this. And then what we want to move on to is, if I get to work, oh, that's right. Here we go. All right. At a certain point, we're going to move into having students create a picture for, obviously, or a movie, an ongoing movie for an entire story. And so we picture some stories initially that are going to be very high in imagery and are going to be self-contained. So they're going to be like a single paragraph long story so that my student can move from picturing for the individual sentences to a story. So remember, if we go through in sequence, we were just looking at an individual picture and having the student describe a picture that's in front of them. They'll then go through and start to create a picture in their mind for a given word that they're not looking at a picture for. They'll describe that. Then we start to image for a sentence. And now we're imaging for multiple sentences within a paragraph. And so if I jump forward to a really great story that I like a lot here, and these are second grade stories. This is a good one to do. And so here we've got the whole passage. I can kind of see where it is that they're going to go. As the teacher, I've pre-read this to myself. I'm not pre-reading it to my student, right? My student's going to move from parts to whole. So when I start the lesson, I'm going to ask them to just picture one sentence at a time. So I'll say this, the title of the story is A Fishy Snack. Young men once held contests to see who could eat the most live goldfish. My student's going to put down a colored square just to represent that they are picturing for that. And I'll say, what do those words make you picture? They start to describe it. Oh, I'm picturing these guys and I can see them holding goldfish and eating them or dropping them in their mouths or something like that, right? And we're questioning to make sure we get a good image for that. And I read them the next sentence. One by one, they grab the wiggling fish from a tank. What do those words make you picture? Student puts down another colored square and says, oh, well, now I'm picturing that they're on a stage and they're reaching into the tank to grab the fish and they're wiggling around. It's hard to get a hold of them. Excellent. What do you picture for now I'll read the next sentence. They dropped the fish in their mouths and swallowed. What do those words make you picture? My student puts down a colored square for that one. Oh, now I'm picturing them tilting their heads back and dropping the fish in. Excellent. But the next sentence, a crowd cringed as each man gulped as many fish as he could. Oh, yeah, nice. Got that one. Oh, I'm picturing the whole audience out there. And so that as the story progresses, their pictures start to match that language, right? Some men ate too many fish and got sick. What do those words make you picture? And they can talk about that one as well, right? So once they've built all of these pictures, what we can then do is go through and get what we call a picture summary, where they can touch each colored square and tell me what it was that they pictured there. Then I'll collect those colored squares and the student will give me a word summary. So using your pictures to help you recall what happened in the story, go back and tell me the story again in your own words, right? And then we can get into asking, of course, now from all of your images, what was the main idea of the story? And we can ask some higher order thinking questions. Why do you think someone would want to win a goldfish eating contest? Do you think it was difficult, right? Why do you think people wanted to watch these contests? Good question. Would you like to compete in a goldfish eating contest, right? All of those different things that we can ask. So if I go back to my slide, and I apologize, I meant to show you all the steps before I dove into the program, but I was excited, so I just dove into it. The steps of VV are, again, to move from helping students establish that vocabulary for a given picture that's in front of them, then helping them create a picture in their mind for a word when they're not looking at that given picture. So I might just say a word like clown. What does that word make you picture? Then we put that word into a sentence and have them image for an entire sentence. The clown was riding on a horse and fell off. And then we move up to imaging for multiple sentences within a paragraph, so sentence by sentence imaging. And we begin to apply higher order thinking to that, and then increase the amount of language that the student's having to create pictures for, from multiple sentences within a paragraph to an entire paragraph to multiple paragraphs on a page. We overlap to writing and apply these skills over to content as well. Right? I appreciate everyone joining in today. I hope that this was useful to you. And I'm picturing that all of you were out there nodding your heads as we went through this presentation. It's an interesting way to try to do a presentation in the world today. Would love to be sitting in a conference room with you all and talking and being able to do a little bit of Q&A. That would be fun. But this is the reality of where we are. So hopefully you all found this to be valuable. My contact information is on there. Lindamood-Bell's website is on there. We'd love to have you go and visit the website, contact us if you're interested in learning more about our programs, if you're interested in learning more about how it is that we provide professional development to districts. Be happy to connect you with folks from those districts who've had the experience of implementing the programs with their students so that you can talk directly with them about what their experience was and why they chose to work with us. Thank you all again very much for working with us today.
And thank you for listening. Learn more about us at lindamood-bell.com. You can also find us on YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. We are Lindamood-Bell.